More than 8 centuries ago, two names echoed across the battlefields of the Middle East with a force that seemed to shake the world itself. One was a Muslim sultan who united divided lands through patience, intelligence, and relentless determination. The other was a Christian king whose courage became legendary even among his enemies. They fought for the same land, commanded thousands of warriors, and inspired generations with stories that blurred the line between history and legend. Yet despite standing on opposite sides of one of history's greatest conflicts, they never met face-to-face in battle. Their rivalry became one of the most fascinating stories ever recorded. Not because one completely defeated the other, but because both changed the course of history forever. When people think about the Crusades, they often imagine endless battles, castles under siege, and armies clashing beneath the burning Middle Eastern sun. But hidden beneath those dramatic images lies a far more complicated story. It is a story about leadership, honor, politics, faith, sacrifice, and the difficult choices that shape civilizations. At the center of it all stood Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. Long before Richard crossed the Mediterranean, the Islamic world was deeply divided. Powerful rulers competed against one another. Cities followed different leaders, and rival dynasties weakened the region from within. These divisions made it easier for the Crusaders to establish their own kingdoms after capturing Jerusalem in 1099. For nearly 90 years, Christian kingdoms remained firmly established throughout the Holy Land, while Muslim rulers struggled to unite against them. Into this divided world came a young man named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, later known across history as Saladin. Born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, he did not appear destined to become one of history's greatest military leaders. His family belonged to Kurdish origins, and his early years were far removed from the glory that would eventually surround his name. Unlike many famous conquerors, Saladin was not remembered for extraordinary strength or reckless bravery in his youth. Instead, he was known for his intelligence, patience, calm personality, and devotion to learning. As a young man, Saladin studied religion, law, literature, and military strategy. Those around him noticed that he listened far more than he spoke. While others rushed toward fame through dramatic victories, Saladin quietly observed the world around him. Few could have guessed that this thoughtful young scholar would one day command armies stretching across Egypt, Syria, and beyond. His rise began under the service of the powerful ruler Nur ad-Din, who recognized his potential. Saladin accompanied military expeditions into Egypt, a wealthy land whose political instability attracted the attention of both Muslim and Crusader leaders. Egypt was not simply another kingdom. Whoever controlled its enormous wealth could influence the balance of power across the entire region. The campaigns in Egypt were dangerous and filled with shifting alliances. Enemies became allies overnight, while trusted partners suddenly changed sides. Saladin survived these dangerous years through careful diplomacy as much as military skill. Rather than seeking unnecessary battles, he preferred solutions that strengthened his position over time. Eventually, Saladin became the vizier of Egypt. It was an extraordinary achievement for someone who only years earlier had remained largely unknown. Yet becoming vizier was only the beginning. Over the following years, he transformed Egypt politically, economically, and militarily. He reorganized its administration, strengthened its defenses, restored financial stability, and gradually united Egypt with Syria under his leadership. While Saladin's influence expanded across the Islamic world, another child was growing up thousands of kilometers away in Europe. Richard Plantagenet was born in 1157 into one of Europe's most powerful royal families. His father was King Henry II of England, while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, controlled one of the richest territories in medieval France. Richard inherited enormous wealth, political influence, and military expectations from birth. Unlike Saladin's quiet youth, Richard grew up surrounded by knights, tournaments, castles, and constant warfare. Medieval Europe celebrated courage above almost everything else, and Richard embraced that ideal completely. He became an exceptional horseman, skilled swordsman, and fearless battlefield commander long before becoming king. Richard's family life, however, was filled with conflict. His father constantly struggled to maintain control over his vast empire, while Richard and his brothers repeatedly challenged his authority. These family disputes taught Richard valuable lessons about politics, but also hardened his personality. He learned that loyalty could disappear quickly and that power often depended on decisive action. As Richard matured, stories of his bravery spread across Europe. He earned admiration not because he avoided danger, but because he seemed to seek it. He led charges personally, fought beside ordinary soldiers, and displayed extraordinary confidence during combat. These qualities eventually earned him the famous title by which history remembers him, Richard the Lionheart. By the late 12th century, events in the Holy Land were reaching a critical turning point. Saladin had accomplished something few believed possible. Through diplomacy, military victories, and political skill, he had united much of the Muslim world under a single leadership. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Crusader states faced an opponent capable of matching their strength. Yet Saladin understood that unity alone would not guarantee victory. The Crusader kingdoms possessed formidable castles, experienced knights, and strong connections with Europe. Any attempt to challenge them required careful planning. Tensions steadily increased. Small raids became larger confrontations. Border disputes escalated into military campaigns. Both sides prepared for the possibility that a decisive war was approaching. The immediate spark came through the actions of Reynaud of Chatillon, one of the most controversial Crusader nobles. Despite existing peace agreements, Reynaud repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans and threatened pilgrimage routes. Some accounts even describe plans to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, though historians continue debating the extent of those ambitions. For Saladin, these repeated violations represented more than political provocation. They undermined every effort to preserve stability. Diplomatic protests achieved little. Negotiations failed. Eventually, war became unavoidable. In 1187, Saladin gathered an enormous army from across his united territories. Soldiers arrived from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Different languages echoed throughout the camps, but they shared one objective. The Crusader kingdoms responded by assembling nearly every available fighting force they possessed. Neither side fully understood that they were marching toward one of the most decisive battles in medieval history. The hills surrounding Hattin would soon witness events that transformed not only the Crusades, but the relationship between Europe and the Islamic world forever. The summer sun showed no mercy. As the Crusader army marched across the dry hills of Galilee, every step became more difficult than the last. Heavy armor trapped the heat against the bodies of the knights. Horses struggled through the dusty terrain. Water became more valuable than gold. Saladin had no intention of defeating his enemy through reckless charges alone. He understood something that many commanders ignored. Battles were often decided long before swords crossed. Logistics, geography, weather, and patience could destroy an army before combat even began. Instead of meeting the Crusaders in a direct confrontation, Saladin carefully controlled their movements. His cavalry harassed their columns from a distance, attacking briefly before disappearing again. They prevented access to wells and forced the Crusaders farther away from reliable water sources. The Christian army continued marching, believing that reaching the city of Tiberias would relieve pressure on their allies. But every kilometer exhausted both men and animals. The heat became unbearable. Many soldiers had already emptied their water containers. Lips cracked beneath the burning sun. Horses collapsed along the road. Discipline slowly gave way to desperation. Saladin watched everything. His scouts constantly reported the Crusaders' position, their pace, and even signs of exhaustion spreading through the ranks. Every decision was calculated. Every delay weakened his opponents. As night approached, the Crusaders stopped near the twin volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. They had hoped to reach water before sunset. Instead, they found only dry grass and endless dust. The nearest lake remained frustratingly out of reach. Throughout the night, Muslim forces surrounded the exhausted army without launching a full assault. They denied sleep, maintained constant pressure, and waited for morning. At dawn on July 4th, 1187, the battle finally began. Smoke drifted across the battlefield as dry vegetation caught fire. Whether intentionally set by Saladin's forces or fueled naturally by the chaos of combat, the result was devastating. Thick smoke mixed with scorching heat, making breathing difficult and reducing visibility. The Crusaders attempted repeated charges. Their famous heavy cavalry had broken enemy lines many times before. But this battlefield was different. The knights lacked fresh horses. Their formations had weakened. Archers continuously targeted them from safer distances. Every charge cost precious energy. Every retreat brought greater confusion. Saladin refused to lose control. Rather than risking everything in one massive attack, he allowed the Crusader army to exhaust itself. Hour after hour, the balance shifted. Eventually, organized resistance collapsed. Many Crusader soldiers surrendered. Others attempted to flee. Some continued fighting until the very end. Among the prisoners captured that day stood King Guy of Jerusalem and many of the kingdom's highest-ranking nobles. It was one of the greatest victories in medieval military history. The defeat shattered the military strength of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem almost overnight. Yet one prisoner attracted more attention than any other: Renaud of Châtillon. For years, Renaud had ignored peace agreements, attacked caravans, and threatened Muslim pilgrims. Saladin had personally vowed that if Renaud ever fell into his hands, justice would follow. Historical sources describe a remarkable scene. King Guy was offered cold water after his capture. When Guy attempted to pass the drink to Renaud, Saladin reportedly explained that he had offered hospitality only to the king, not to Renaud. In medieval traditions, accepting food or drink from a ruler could symbolize protection. Soon afterward, Renaud was executed. King Guy, however, was spared. This distinction reflected Saladin's belief that rulers captured in honorable battle should not automatically be killed, while those who repeatedly violated sworn agreements faced different consequences. News of Hattin spread rapidly. Castle after castle surrendered. Town after town opened its gates. Without the army destroyed at Hattin, the Crusader states possessed little ability to defend themselves. Only a few months later, Saladin approached the city that had inspired nearly a century of conflict: Jerusalem. For Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, Jerusalem was far more than a strategic fortress. It was a sacred city. Its streets carried centuries of religious history. Its walls represented far more than military strength. In 1099, when the First Crusaders captured Jerusalem, many inhabitants were killed during the assault. The memory of that event remained vivid throughout the Muslim world. Now, nearly 90 years later, history seemed ready to turn another page. Would Saladin seek revenge? Would another massacre follow? The world waited for the answer. Jerusalem prepared for the worst. Inside the city, fear spread quickly. Families gathered what little they could carry. Priests prayed in churches while soldiers repaired damaged sections of the walls. Many remembered the stories of the First Crusade and wondered whether the city would now experience another bloodbath. Saladin surrounded Jerusalem in September 1187. His army vastly outnumbered the defenders, but the city's walls still presented a formidable obstacle. For days, fighting continued around the fortifications as defenders resisted every assault. Eventually, the city's leaders realized that no relief army was coming. Negotiations began. The man leading Jerusalem's defense, Balian of Ibelin, met with Saladin to discuss terms. Both men understood what was at stake. If talks failed, thousands of civilians could lose their lives. After careful negotiation, an agreement was reached. Many inhabitants were allowed to leave the city after paying a ransom. Those who could not afford it were not all abandoned to their fate. Historical sources record that Saladin, along with members of his family and several of his commanders, paid the ransom for many impoverished prisoners out of their own resources, allowing them to go free. Churches remained standing. Christian worship continued. The city changed rulers, but it was not devastated. The capture of Jerusalem shocked Europe. The loss of Christianity's holiest city inspired an enormous response. Popes called for a new crusade. Kings who had rarely agreed on anything suddenly found themselves preparing for war. Among them was Richard, newly crowned King of England. Although his reign had barely begun, Richard placed the crusade above nearly everything else. He raised vast sums of money, gathered one of the strongest armies Europe could provide, and sailed toward the eastern Mediterranean with a single goal: to recover Jerusalem. The campaign that followed became known as the Third Crusade. Richard immediately demonstrated why his reputation frightened even experienced commanders. At the Siege of Acre, his leadership helped secure one of the Crusaders' most important victories. Despite illness, he continued directing military operations, inspiring his soldiers through personal courage. Saladin watched carefully. He quickly realized that this new opponent was unlike many previous Crusader leaders. Richard was bold, aggressive, unpredictable, and extraordinarily skilled in battle. The conflict soon became a contest between two of history's greatest commanders. At the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, Richard achieved one of his finest victories. Saladin's forces repeatedly attacked the marching Crusader column, hoping to break its formation. Richard refused to rush. He maintained discipline for hours despite constant pressure. Only when the perfect moment arrived did he unleash his famous heavy cavalry. The charge struck with tremendous force. Saladin's army withdrew in good order, preserving much of its strength, but the battlefield belonged to Richard. The victory restored Crusader confidence. Yet it did not end the war. Again and again, the two leaders outmaneuvered one another. Richard won battles. Saladin controlled the wider strategic situation. Neither commander could achieve complete victory. One of the most remarkable aspects of their rivalry was the respect that gradually developed between them. Although they remained determined enemies, medieval chronicles describe repeated exchanges of gifts, physicians, fruit, and messages during periods of negotiation. When Richard became ill, later traditions recount that Saladin sent fresh fruit and medical assistance. Some details differ between historical accounts, but the broader picture is clear. Both leaders recognized greatness in the other. Both understood that courage could exist on opposite sides of the battlefield. Contrary to popular legend, Saladin and Richard almost certainly never met face to face. Their conversations took place through trusted envoys. Their decisions shaped armies separated by only a few kilometers. Yet history remembers them as rivals, whose influence reached far beyond the battles they fought. By 1192, years of campaigning had exhausted both sides. Richard needed to return to Europe to deal with political threats at home. Saladin also faced the enormous challenge of governing his vast territories. Neither could continue the conflict indefinitely. Negotiations produced the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. However, Christian pilgrims were permitted to visit the Holy City peacefully. The Crusader kingdom survived along parts of the coast, while the fragile peace replaced constant warfare. It was not the complete victory either side had hoped for, but it prevented further devastation and offered both civilizations a chance to recover. Only a few months after Richard departed for Europe, Saladin's health declined rapidly. In March 1193, he died in Damascus. Despite ruling an empire stretching across much of the Middle East, he left behind surprisingly little personal wealth. Much of what he had possessed had been given away through charity and public works. Richard continued facing political struggles in Europe until his death in 1199 after being wounded during the siege of a castle in France. Both men were gone within a decade. Their legend, however, had only begun. Centuries later, Muslims remembered Saladin as the ruler who reunited divided lands and restored Jerusalem. Europe remembered Richard as the fearless Lionheart whose courage inspired generations of knights. Modern historians recognize something even more remarkable. Their rivalry demonstrated that history is rarely divided into simple heroes and villains. Two extraordinary leaders, driven by different beliefs and loyalties, confronted one another with unmatched determination. They fought fierce battles. They defended causes they considered sacred. They reshaped the medieval world. Yet amid one of history's greatest religious conflicts, they also showed that respect between enemies was possible. That is why the names Saladin and Richard the Lionheart still echo across history, not simply because they fought, but because their rivalry became one of the greatest examples of leadership, courage, strategy, and honor the world has ever known. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's greatest rivalries, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next deep dive into the stories that changed the world forever. Until next time, thank you for watching.